Welcome to Midnight Fatal Cases. We tell these stories quietly, because volume doesn't make the truth clearer. On this channel, we focus on real people, real loss, and the slow details that lead to irreversible outcomes. No sensationalism, no cheap thrills. Just a careful, respectful look at what happened and what it did to everyone left behind. Tonight's case begins with 3 disappearances and 1 Tinder match that turned suspicion into panic. Get comfortable. Turn down the noise around you. And let's begin. Chapter 1. The Hook. There are disappearances that arrive like a thunderclap. And then there are the ones that seep in quietly, like water under a door, until you look down and realize your feet are already soaked. In Toronto, in the late stretch of autumn, the city keeps moving no matter what happens beneath its lights. Streetcars rattle past crowded patios turned into windbreak cages. Office towers glow long after midnight. Condos rise like stacks of glass, and behind those windows, lives fold and unfold in private. The first time a young woman didn't come home, it felt like a single missing step in a familiar routine. A phone that went to voicemail. A last message that ended with a punctuation mark that didn't fit her. A friend checking the weather and saying maybe her battery died, maybe she fell asleep at someone's place, maybe she just needed space. Toronto is full of maybes. If you live in a city like this long enough, you learn to accept gaps. A late reply, a missed call, a person who disappears from your life because their life is busy or messy or just turning in a direction that doesn't include you anymore. The city teaches you not to panic too quickly because panic is exhausting, and because most of the time the explanation is ordinary. But by the time the 3rd young woman vanished, the maybes turned heavy. They stopped sounding like explanations. They started sounding like prayers. People would later argue about the exact moment the city understood what it was looking at. Some said it was when the first poster went up on a lamppost near Queen Street. Fresh ink, a smiling photo, a number to call. Some said it was when a second poster appeared 2 weeks later, taped crookedly under the first, the 2 faces staring out like they'd been introduced by fate. And some said it was when the 3rd poster joined them, and the paper started to curl from rain, and the pictures became a row. 3 girls, 3 families, 3 sets of friends who had to learn a new language overnight, the language of waiting, of bargaining, of checking the same streets again and again, of looking at strangers with quiet suspicion and then hating yourself for it. A few nights after the 3rd disappearance, a bartender in the entertainment district told a regular customer about something he'd heard. Not a confession, not a sighting, just a pattern. The bartender had a habit of listening. It came with the job. You hear the way people talk when they think nobody important is listening. He said they all use Tinder. He didn't say it like gossip. He said it like a man testing the weight of a word in his mouth, unsure if it would taste like truth. That sentence traveled farther than the posters did. It moved through group chats and office kitchens. It slipped into late-night calls between roommates. It was repeated by older siblings and eventually by parents who hadn't used a dating app in their lives but suddenly wanted to understand every little icon on a screen. In a city built on strangers passing strangers, a dating app felt like the closest thing to an address. And as fear sharpened, one idea began to take shape, crude at first, like a sketch on fogged glass. One man, a profile, a face that looked ordinary enough to disappear back into the crowd. No one knew his name yet. Not publicly, not with certainty. But some people swore they had seen him. A friend of a friend who remembered a date that ended early. A woman who recalled a conversation that felt off. A screenshot that seemed harmless until it didn't. In the days that followed, the public would do what the public always does when terrified. They would try to find the edges of the darkness, to outline it, to give it a shape they could hold. They would trade half-facts for comfort. They would turn "I think" into "I know." And somewhere in all of it, 3 young women stopped being faces on posters and became a question the city could not stop asking. What does it take for a person to vanish in a place this crowded? You can disappear in a big city without anyone meaning for it to happen. You can miss a train and miss a call and miss a turn and suddenly you are out of frame, out of sync, out of reach. But these disappearances didn't feel like drifting. They felt like being taken. At first, the news coverage was cautious. Police spokespeople used careful phrases, unconfirmed, no indication. We are exploring all possibilities. They reminded the public that adults could choose to go missing, that investigations took time, that speculation could harm the process. And they were right. Speculation can destroy an innocent life in hours. But fear does not wait for official language to catch up. It fills the silence. It builds its own story. In the city's quieter corners, people started making small changes without discussing them. A woman stopped leaving the gym at night with her headphones in. A roommate began sharing her location before a date, treating it like a casual thing, like it wasn't a direct response to a rising dread. Friends started insisting on pickup plans, on check-in texts, on code words that meant, "Call me now, something is wrong." The routines that once felt adult and free suddenly felt fragile. And then, one evening, a mother stood outside a subway station with a handful of flyers and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to rest. Her daughter's name was Maya Chen. Maya was 21, a university student, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and returned borrowed books. The kind of person who sent voice notes when she was too tired to type, because she still wanted to hear someone else's voice in return. Her mother held the flyers with both hands, as if they could blow away. Across the street, someone recognized the photo, not from the posters. From a social media post that had been shared so many times, it felt like the city itself was trying to carry her home. A passerby slowed down, then another, then another. People accepted flyers with that careful gentleness reserved for grief. But one man didn't slow. He looked and then he walked faster. Maya's mother noticed. Not because she knew him, she didn't, but because when you are living inside a disappearance, you start noticing everything. The angle of someone's shoulders, the way they keep their hands in their pockets, the speed in their step when they realize your eyes are on them, the way a person's breathing changes when they sense attention. She watched him vanish into the crowd and felt something twist in her chest. She would later say, in a voice that barely held together, it was like he didn't want to be seen. At the time, that meant nothing. It could have meant anything. In a city like Toronto, you can read guilt into a stranger's face and be wrong. But that night, as streetlights glared against wet pavement and the air smelled like exhaust and cold metal, it was enough to keep her awake. Because 3 girls were gone. And in the space they had left behind, the city's imagination had started pointing at one place. A swipe, a match, a date arranged in the thin space between trust and loneliness. If you opened Tinder in those days, the screen looked the same as it always had. Smiling faces, bio jokes, photos taken in good lighting, designed to offer reassurance. But now, behind every profile, there was a shadow question. Who are you really? And what do you want from me? This story begins before any arrest, before any press conference, before any certainty. It begins in the moment where a city realizes it has been operating on assumptions it cannot afford anymore. That strangers are safe until proven otherwise. That apps are just tools. That meeting someone for a drink is a small risk, nothing more. The posters on the lampposts did not answer those questions. They only asked them louder. And somewhere, in the same city, someone else was watching too, watching the posters go up, watching the shares multiply, watching the fear bloom. Watching and waiting for the moment the search would turn into a hunt. Because when people are desperate for a reason, they will accept a suspect the way a drowning person accepts a hand, even if they don't know what that hand is attached to. In the early hours, the city's online forums lit up with threads that moved faster than any official bulletin. People compared timestamps. They circled locations on shared maps. They argued over whether the disappearances were connected at all, and whether saying they were connected was reckless. Some of those threads were filled with compassion, rides offered, phone numbers shared, a stranger volunteering to walk someone home from a late shift. Others were darker. They treated the missing as a puzzle, their lives reduced to fragments that could be arranged and rearranged. A photograph from a night out, a tagged location, a smile that, in hindsight, looked forced, as if anyone could measure that from a picture. In one post, someone wrote a list of rules like commandments. Never meet in a private place. Never accept a ride. Never let your drink out of your sight. Never tell him where you live. Always screenshot the profile. Always send it to someone. Always. 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 But the trouble with rules is that they appear after the fact. They arrive when the danger is already real enough to name, and they do nothing for the people who already stepped into it. Olivia Hart disappeared next. Olivia was 22 and worked a part-time job at a boutique near Kensington Market, the kind of place that sold soft sweaters and expensive candles and played music low enough that you could pretend the world outside wasn't sharp. She lived with 2 roommates in a narrow house that leaned slightly, as old Toronto houses do, and she had a laugh that carried through walls. The night she vanished, her friends remembered the last normal detail. She had asked which boots looked better, the ones with the scuffed toe or the ones she saved for nice. It was such an ordinary question. That detail haunted them later because it meant she had expected to come back. And then there was Sofia Alvarez. Sofia was 19. She had moved to the city recently, still learning which streets curved and which ones ran straight, still saving transit directions even after she'd taken the same route 10 times. She was the kind of person who apologized too often, as if taking up space required permission. She disappeared on a Tuesday. Tuesday is not the day people expect a crisis, but life doesn't schedule horror for weekends. By the time Sofia's family filed the missing person report, the police had already heard the word Tinder in whispers. They hadn't said it out loud, not in any official sense, but the investigators were not blind to patterns. They asked the same questions in different ways. Had she met anyone new? Had she been seeing someone? Had she mentioned a date? Had she shared her location with anyone? Families answered as best they could, and when they couldn't, they felt the shame of not knowing their own child's private life. Because a dating app is private by design, it lives in the small space between a locked phone and a person's desire to be seen. For the friends of the missing, Tinder became a crime scene you could scroll through. They opened the app with trembling fingers as if the glow of the screen might burn. They searched message histories for anything unusual. They stared at the last active time like it was a heartbeat. Some of them did something else, too. They began to swipe. Not for love. Not for fun. For recognition. They compared faces to the blur of memory. They looked for the same smile, the same angle, the same kind of casual confidence that, in hindsight, felt rehearsed. And every time they matched with someone who felt even slightly wrong, they would send the profile to a group chat labeled something like safety, or girls, or, later, please. This is the part of the story that never makes people feel comfortable. Because the app didn't change. The people did. In the days after the 3rd disappearance, a particular profile began to circulate among small circles of friends. It wasn't labeled as evil. It wasn't announced as a villain. It was shared with question marks and unease. A man in his late 20s, maybe early 30s. Clean haircut. Neutral smile. Photos that could have been taken anywhere. An outdoor patio, a hiking trail, a dim bar with neon behind him. His bio was minimal. A few words. A joking line that could be interpreted as charming. Or cold. Different people remembered him differently. Some swore he had a tattoo on his wrist. Others insisted he didn't. Some said his voice sounded flat over the phone, as if he was reading. Others said he was warm, even funny. That inconsistency made him more frightening, not less. Because it suggested the kind of person who could adjust himself to the room he was in. A shape that fit. And here is where the hook tightens. The police at that point did not have a public suspect. They had not named anyone. They had not asked for a manhunt. They had not even confirmed the cases were linked. But people in the city had already begun to link them in their minds, because linking them meant you could look for one thing instead of 3. One story instead of 3. One man instead of a universe of possibilities. And that need, the need to narrow terror into something you can point at, was about to collide with reality in a way no one could control. Because somewhere in the same city, there was a man who understood what was happening. He understood that fear was turning the air electric. He understood that people were sharing screenshots. He understood that the game of strangers on a screen had begun to feel like a trap. And he understood something else too. If the city decided he was the answer, it would come for him. Even if he wasn't. Or especially if he was. Chapter 2. Context and people. Before anyone went missing, before posters and screenshots and fear-laced conversations, their lives were quiet in the way most young lives are quiet. Not empty, just unremarkable to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. Maya Chen grew up in a household where achievement was spoken softly but expected loudly. Her parents had immigrated years earlier, carrying with them the belief that stability came from education, from steady routines, from not drawing attention to yourself in a world that already had its opinions. Maya learned early how to balance that weight. She studied hard. She worked part-time. She laughed easily with friends who knew how seriously she took things beneath the surface. She used Tinder the way many students did. Not as a promise. Not as a plan. More like a window you opened when the nights felt too quiet. She wasn't reckless. Her friends would say that over and over later, as if repetition could protect her reputation. She met people in public places. She shared details selectively. She trusted, but not blindly. Olivia Hart's life looked different, but the underlying rhythm was the same. She had moved to Toronto because she wanted motion. She liked the idea of being anonymous in a crowd, of choosing who she wanted to be on any given night. She worked retail, complained about tourists, and saved money for trips she talked about more than she planned. Dating apps, for Olivia, were a way to punctuate the city. A coffee here, a drink there, a conversation that sometimes went nowhere and sometimes surprised her. She had ended dates early before. She had blocked people without explanation. She was comfortable asserting herself. That detail would become important later, though no one realized it at the time. Sofia Alvarez was newer to everything. New city, new routines, new freedoms that felt both intoxicating and intimidating. She had left a smaller place where everyone knew her family, where privacy was scarce and expectations were heavy. Toronto felt like a place where she could stretch without being watched. She downloaded Tinder because everyone else did. Because it seemed easier than walking into a room full of strangers and announcing that you were open to connection. Because it let her control the pace. She was cautious. But she was also 19, and caution is still a skill you are learning at that age. None of the three girls knew each other. That fact mattered. They moved through different neighborhoods, different circles, different schedules. There was no shared class, no shared workplace, no shared friend who could connect the dots cleanly. Their only overlap at first glance was the city itself. And an app. Toronto police were aware of the missing persons reports as they came in. Each case was logged. Each was assigned. Each followed procedure. Detectives interviewed roommates and family members. They retraced last known movements. They checked transit records and phone pings where possible. What they didn't do, at least not publicly, was rush to connect them. Because disappearances can cluster without sharing a cause. Because young adults leave. Because assuming a pattern too early can blind an investigation to other explanations. Behind closed doors, though, questions were asked. Quiet ones. The kind that don't make it into press statements. 3 young women. Similar age range. Same city. Short window of time. And then, more hesitantly, dating apps? The answers came back unevenly. Yes, but casually. Yes, but nothing serious. Yes, but no red flags that stood out. Red flags are easy to identify in retrospect. Much harder when you're standing inside the moment. Friends of the missing began comparing notes without meaning to. Someone would mention a bar, and someone else would say, she went there too. Someone would mention a general area, and someone else would say, that's not far from where she was last seen. These overlaps were loose, suggestive but not definitive. Still, they fed the sense that something was wrong. The suspected man did not appear all at once. He emerged in fragments. A screenshot here, a remembered voice there, a name that might have been spelled one way or another. His profile, when people finally compared them side by side, looked unremarkable. That was the most disturbing part. He didn't stand out. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't project anything that would have triggered alarm on its own. He looked like someone you would pass on the sidewalk without noticing. Some women recalled matching with him weeks earlier and letting the conversation fade. Others remembered meeting him briefly and deciding there was no chemistry. One remembered a date that ended politely, but left her feeling unsettled in a way she couldn't articulate. He asked a lot of questions, she would say later. Not in a creepy way. Just a lot. At the time, she hadn't told anyone that detail. It didn't feel significant enough to share. Now it echoed. The police began to receive tips, though they didn't call them that yet. Informal calls, emails that began with apologies, messages that emphasized uncertainty. I don't want to cause trouble, but this might be nothing, but I'm probably overthinking this. Fear makes people doubt their instincts even as it sharpens them. Detectives logged every contact. They cross-referenced names where they could. They checked whether any single profile appeared in multiple accounts. The problem with Tinder, from an investigative standpoint, is that it's designed to be temporary. Conversations disappear. Profiles change. People delete accounts and create new ones. Location data is approximate. Names can be fake. It is a digital space built on controlled ambiguity, which makes it fertile ground for misunderstanding and for exploitation. The suspected man, still unnamed, still unconfirmed, continued to live his life in the city. He went to work. He bought groceries. He stood on platforms waiting for trains. If he noticed the posters, he did not react in any way anyone could confirm. But others reacted for him. Someone recognized his photo from a shared screenshot and confronted him online. Not directly accusing, not explicitly threatening, just asking questions that felt pointed. Hey, did you ever go out with a girl named Maya? Random question, were you downtown last Friday? He did not respond. Silence became its own kind of evidence in the court of public opinion. Within days, speculation hardened. Online threads stopped asking whether the cases were connected and started asking why the police hadn't arrested anyone yet. Names were floated and discarded. Faces were analyzed. Innocent men were briefly pulled into the orbit of suspicion and then spat back out when the details didn't line up. It was messy. It was human. And it was dangerous. Families of the missing watched all of this unfold with a mixture of hope and horror. Hope, because attention meant momentum. Horror, because attention has a way of consuming nuance. Maya's parents were cautious. They spoke to police. They spoke to the media when asked. They avoided online forums. They trusted process even when it moved slowly. Olivia's roommates did the opposite. They scoured every platform. They joined every group. They answered messages from strangers who claimed to have seen something, heard something, remembered something. Sophia's family struggled most with the idea of Tinder itself. They asked questions that revealed a generational gap, not judgment, just confusion. How could you trust someone you met on a phone? How did you know who they really were? There were no satisfying answers. Because the truth is, most people don't know who anyone really is at first. That's not a flaw of technology. It's a feature of being human. As days passed, the city began to shift its behavior in small, telling ways. Bars posted signs about meeting safely. Universities sent out vague safety emails that mentioned awareness without naming a threat. Rideshare usage spiked at night, but beneath those surface adjustments was something harder to measure. Trust was thinning. People looked at each other a little longer before deciding how close to stand. Conversations on first dates included more disclaimers, more defenses. Jokes about serial killers landed poorly, if at all, and still no one had been found. No bodies. No arrests. No answers. Just 3 lives suspended in absence, and one man hovering in the background of the city's imagination, becoming heavier with every unanswered question. What the public didn't see in those first weeks were the little negotiations inside each household. Maya's father began leaving his phone volume on high at night, even though the sound startled him awake every time it buzzed. Maya's mother slept in short bursts on the couch because the couch was closer to the front door, and she couldn't explain why that mattered. It just did. Olivia's roommates stopped using her favorite mug. They washed it and put it back in the cupboard like it was a fragile relic. One of them kept checking Olivia's closet, touching the hangers, half expecting the clothes to be rearranged as if she'd come home and gotten ready for work. Sophia's older brother drove routes after his shift ended. He told no one. He didn't want praise. He didn't want pity. He just needed to do something with his hands besides clench them. Detective Laura Bennett, assigned to one of the files, was the kind of investigator who distrusted dramatic breaks. She preferred slow consistency. She worked from paper notes, not because she didn't trust technology, but because she trusted her own eyes more. She read witness statements like literature, looking for the sentences people didn't realize were important. She underlined one phrase from a friend of Maya's. Something felt rehearsed. Then she found the same idea in a different file. Like he knew what to say, and in a third, too smooth, rehearsed. Smooth. Controlled. Not criminal words, but words that, repeated across unrelated mouths, start to form a pattern. At the same time, another detective, Aidan Clark, took the opposite approach. He chased data. He requested cell site records. He begged for transit footage. He pulled every receipt he could find. He didn't believe in intuition without something solid underneath it. Bennett and Clark argued, not out of ego, but because cases like this demand friction. One wrong assumption can turn an investigation into a tunnel. One missed detail can make you walk past the only door that matters. Their supervisor, Sergeant Michelle Park, let them argue. Then she said, "Bring me one thing you both agree on." They did. The app mattered. It didn't have to be the only factor. It didn't have to be the method. But it was the most consistent bridge between otherwise separate lives. And bridges are where people get intercepted. Chapter 3. Escalation. The shift happened quietly, not with sirens or press conferences, but with a change in how people spoke to each other. At first, conversations about the missing girls had been careful, gentle. Framed by hope, people said when, not if. When she comes back. When they find her. When this is cleared up. As days stretched into weeks, that language hardened. When turned into if. And then slowly it disappeared altogether. Police resources expanded. More officers were assigned. Data analysts were brought in to look for overlaps that human eyes might miss. Transit footage was reviewed in long, exhausting shifts. Not because it was expected to reveal a clear answer, but because not checking felt irresponsible. Investigations are built on the idea that truth leaves residue. A timestamp. A reflection in glass. A transaction record. But in these cases, the residue was thin. Phones had gone quiet at different times. Locations stopped updating. Last messages felt ordinary enough that they offered no clear emotional trajectory. There were no alarming goodbyes. No sudden changes in tone. Just conversations that ended midstream the way so many do. The city filled that silence on its own. The suspected Tinder profile gained a nickname online. Not a real name. Something easier to type. Easier to remember. Easier to fear. People spoke about him as if he were already a confirmed fact, a character in a story that only needed the final chapter written. That certainty was built on repetition, not proof. Screenshots were shared and reshared until their origins blurred. Details changed slightly each time. A location moved a few blocks. A date shifted by a day. A phrase was remembered differently. Memory is not static under stress. It bends toward meaning. A woman came forward to police after recognizing the profile circulating online. She said she had gone on a date with him months earlier. Coffee. Daytime. Public place. Nothing overtly threatening. "So why are you here now?" the detective asked. She paused before answering. "Because I can't stop thinking about how normal it was," she said. "And how that scares me." She described the way he listened without reacting. The way he asked follow-up questions that felt practiced. The way he smiled at moments where she hadn't expected a smile. These are not crimes. They are impressions. But impressions matter when there is nothing else to hold on to. Another woman remembered matching with him and exchanging messages that felt slightly off. Not explicit. Not aggressive. Just persistent. He responded quickly. He steered the conversation back when it drifted. He seemed unusually invested for someone who claimed to be casual about dating. She unmatched him after a few days. "I didn't think he was dangerous," she said later. "I just didn't like how focused he was." Focus is a trait people praise until they don't. Police attempted to identify the man behind the profile through official channels. Requests were sent. Warrants were prepared. Dating app data is protected fiercely and for good reason. It takes time to pierce that wall, even when urgency presses from all sides. While investigators waited, the public did not. Someone posted a blurred photo taken from behind on a subway platform. They claimed it was him. Someone else pointed out that it could have been anyone. Arguments erupted in comment sections. Accusations flew. Innocent men were tagged, harassed, frightened. One of them went to police himself, terrified that his life was about to collapse under a rumor he didn't understand. This is the collateral damage of fear. And still, no one knew where the girls were. Maya's friends held on to routines because abandoning them felt like admitting something they weren't ready to admit. They went to class. They went to work. They checked their phones obsessively, refreshing feeds, rereading old messages as if hidden meaning might reveal itself on the 100th read. Olivia's roommates stopped sleeping through the night. Every sound outside their narrow house felt intrusive. They jumped at footsteps on the stairs, at the creak of the doorframe settling. They kept lights on, as if darkness itself had become suspicious. Sophia's family oscillated between hope and despair in the same hour. A reported sighting would lift them. A day without news would crush them. They learned the rhythm of police updates, the careful wording that signaled progress, and the equally careful wording that signaled nothing. Behind all of this, the suspected man remained unconfirmed. Police finally identified a person of interest who matched the profile details closely enough to warrant an interview. He was cooperative, calm. He answered questions without visible agitation. He provided alibis that could be partially verified. Partially. That word became another crack in the foundation of certainty. Partial verification is not exoneration, but it is not guilt either. The interview did not yield a confession. It did not yield physical evidence. It yielded impressions that mirrored what women had described online. Controlled. Attentive. Unreadable. The detectives left with more questions than answers. And then something changed. A new detail surfaced, not from a tip or a screenshot, but from data. One of the missing phones had briefly connected to a network days after it was last active. Not a call. Not a message. Just a signal. A quiet handshake between device and infrastructure. It didn't last long enough to trace precisely, but it was enough to suggest intent. Phones do not wake themselves up. Someone had turned it on. The location was approximate. A general area. Industrial. Sparse at night. Not a place people linger by accident. Search teams were dispatched. Volunteers gathered. Flashlights cut through darkness. Dogs were brought in. The air filled with that peculiar tension that exists only during active searches, when every discarded object feels significant. Nothing was found, but hope had shifted again, because now the disappearances felt less like drifting and more like control. The city reacted accordingly. Dating app usage dipped. Profiles added disclaimers. People met in groups. Some stopped dating altogether, deciding loneliness was safer than risk. And through it all, the name of the suspected man hardened from rumor into expectation. People waited for his arrest the way they wait for a storm they can already smell. But investigations do not move at the speed of fear. They move at the speed of evidence. And evidence, in this case, was slow, painfully slow. The more the public focused on the suspected man, the more the police had to do two jobs at once. One job was the investigation. The other was containment. Containment of rumor, of vigilantism, of a public that wanted certainty more than it wanted accuracy. Officers assigned to community relations spent hours on the phone asking people not to post private information, not to confront strangers, not to share unverified names. Some listened. Some didn't. In one neighborhood meeting, a young woman stood up and said, "So what are we supposed to do? Wait?" Detective Bennett answered carefully. "Yes, and also live. But live with awareness." Awareness was a thin word to offer a room full of fear. Clark kept working the digital angle. He requested preservation orders for app data before it could be deleted. He worked with analysts who could translate a messy stream of pings and timestamps into something that resembled a narrative. What they found was not a smoking gun. It was a silhouette. All three phones had moved at some point in ways that didn't match their owners' habits. Not long trips. Short jumps. Off route. A few minutes that didn't fit with transit patterns. A pause near a major roadway that wasn't a normal stop. Small deviations. But people vanish inside small deviations all the time. Bennett spent her evenings calling women who had offered tips. She heard the same conflict in many of them. They wanted to help. They were afraid of being dramatic. They were afraid of being wrong. They were afraid of being right. One woman described a date where the man insisted she turn off her location sharing, "So we can be present." She laughed as she told it, then went quiet. "I didn't do it," she said. "But I keep thinking, why would he ask?" Another woman described a man who arrived in a different car than the one he'd mentioned. Not a big detail. People change rides, but he had made a point of mentioning a car earlier, as if setting an expectation mattered. Then, as if to correct himself, he joked about being hard to track. It had sounded playful at the time. Now it sounded like a test. The city's fear began to show up in smaller, more private ways. Friends stopped sharing their live locations after dates because they didn't want to scare each other, then started again because not sharing felt reckless. People practiced turning down invitations in polite tones, then practiced saying no more sharply, as if volume could be armor. Nothing in the streets looked different, but the air did. Even the safest neighborhoods felt slightly staged, like a set where something could move wrong at any time. And then, in the middle of a routine review, Clark noticed something that made him sit up. A rideshare receipt, emailed to Olivia, showed a pickup that didn't match her stated destination. It was only a few blocks off. It could have been a driver reroute. It could have been a typo. But the timestamp lined up with a gap in the transit footage, a blind spot where camera angles overlapped imperfectly. A gap is not evidence, but it is a place to look. They looked. They found nothing. And that nothing began to feel like a deliberate outcome. Chapter 4. The Turning Point. The moment that changes everything rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with certainty or clarity. It arrives disguised as another lead, another update, another phone call that begins with careful words. In this case, it arrived on a gray morning when a detective sat across from a supervisor and said, "We need to reframe how we're looking at this." Up until then, the investigation had been moving outward, casting wider nets, collecting more tips, checking more data points. But the longer the girls remained missing, the more uncomfortable one truth became. If they were alive, someone was actively keeping them that way. And if they were not, someone had already gone to great lengths to erase what happened. Both possibilities demanded a different approach. The suspected man was brought in again. This time the interview was longer, more structured, less conversational. His phone records were examined in detail. His movements were compared against transit footage with greater precision. His social circle was mapped, not because they were suspected, but because patterns often ripple outward. He remained calm. That calm unsettled some investigators and reassured others. Experience teaches detectives that nerves can mean many things. Innocent people panic. Guilty people rehearse. There is no universal tell. But there was something else now. Contradictions. Small ones. Not lies in the dramatic sense. More like adjustments. Times that shifted slightly. Details that became less firm under repetition. Explanations that were technically possible but increasingly strained. He explained that he had deleted his Tinder account shortly after the disappearances became public, claiming he felt uncomfortable being associated with something so dark. That decision, while understandable on the surface, raised eyebrows. People who fear being misunderstood often erase themselves. People who fear being found often do the same. The difference is intention. Search warrants were executed quietly. No flashing lights. No spectacle. His residence was examined methodically. Nothing overtly incriminating was found. No blood. No personal items belonging to the missing. No obvious signs of violence. Absence is the hardest thing to interpret. Investigators are trained to look for what doesn't belong, but in this space, what stood out was what wasn't there. The apartment felt curated, minimal, almost sterile, as if personal history had been reduced to essentials. One officer would later say, "It felt like a place designed to leave no trace." That comment would not make it into any official report, but it lingered. Meanwhile, families were brought in for updates that offered little comfort. They were told the investigation was ongoing, that progress was being made, that all possibilities were still being considered. Hope became procedural, a thing delivered in measured doses, and then weeks later a discovery. Not a body, not a confession, a bag. It was found near a service road on the outskirts of the city, an area rarely visited except by maintenance crews and delivery drivers. Inside were personal items, ordinary things. A charger, a makeup pouch, a bracelet. Items that, when photographed and shown carefully, were recognized. Not by police, by a mother. Maya's mother identified the bracelet immediately. She remembered buying it together. A small thing, inexpensive, chosen on a day that had felt unimportant at the time. Important days rarely announce themselves either. The location reignited everything. Searches resumed with urgency that bordered on desperation. Media attention spiked. The public felt once again that resolution was close enough to taste. The suspected man was detained, not arrested. Detained. The distinction mattered legally. It mattered less emotionally. His name leaked within hours. His face followed. Online judgment was swift and absolute. Employers were contacted. Family members were harassed. Old acquaintances were interrogated by strangers demanding answers they didn't have. This is the turning point most people imagine as justice beginning. In reality, it is chaos. The man maintained his innocence. His lawyer spoke in controlled language. Police emphasized that the investigation was ongoing and urged the public not to jump to conclusions. But the damage was already done. And still, the most important question remained unanswered. Where were the girls? Days turned into nights filled with waiting. Search teams found more items, some confirmed, some inconclusive. Each discovery chipped away at hope in uneven ways. Not all endings arrive at once. Sometimes they erode. Behind the scenes, investigators confronted a possibility they had tried to avoid. That they were no longer looking for 3 living women, but for answers that would never bring them home. The suspected man was released. Insufficient evidence. That phrase landed like a blow. To families, it sounded like failure. To the public, it sounded like injustice. To investigators, it sounded like reality. Because suspicion is not proof. And proof, in this case, remained elusive. But something had changed permanently. The idea that this was coincidence had died. Whatever had happened, it had been deliberate. Careful and patient. And if the man everyone was watching was not responsible, then someone else was. Someone who had not yet been named. The city exhaled and then held its breath again. Because the turning point was not about resolution. It was about understanding that there might not be one. The detention created a strange kind of relief for some people. Relief has an ugly cousin in cases like this. It is the relief of choosing a target. Once the man's name leaked, strangers felt permitted to rewrite his entire history as if it had always been pointing here. Old photos were reinterpreted. Neutral expressions were labeled cold. Ordinary hobbies were framed as suspicious. A hiking picture became scouting. A gym selfie became predatory confidence. Even people who knew him were forced into a binary choice: defend him and look complicit, or condemn him and feel safe. Bennett hated that part, because she had seen what a swarm could do to an innocent person. But she also understood why it happened. When you can't save the missing, you try to punish someone. The evidence team processed the bag found near the service road. They photographed everything. They cataloged fibers. They bagged dirt caught in a zipper seam. They treated the objects with respect because they belonged to a person who could no longer speak for herself. The bracelet that Maya's mother identified was sent for trace testing. It came back with nothing definitive. No clear DNA, no clean fingerprint. Just the ordinary residue of human life, lotions, dust, the faint chemical scent of a city. Ordinary residue, in an extraordinary context, is not comforting. It is frustrating. Clark pushed for another round of warrants. Not just for the detained man's home, but for devices, accounts, backups. Phones keep ghosts in their memory. Old logins, cached locations, deleted fragments that can sometimes be recovered. They found gaps. Not evidence of violence, evidence of cleaning. Files wiped. Apps reinstalled. History erased more thoroughly than most people bother to erase it. Not illegal. Not conclusive. But again, suggestive. Park told them, suggestive doesn't hold in court. Bennett answered, but it holds in reality. The turning point in the end wasn't one discovery. It was the emotional shift inside the investigative team when they realized that the case might never give them a neat resolution, that they might have to choose between charging someone they couldn't fully prove or holding back and letting the public think they had done nothing. They held back. It was the ethically correct choice. It was also unbearable. When the man was released, cameras captured him stepping into daylight with his shoulders tight, his jaw rigid, his eyes fixed ahead. A human reaction, whatever his guilt or innocence. Behind him, his attorney spoke about due process and presumption of innocence. Across the street, Maya's mother did not speak. She stared as if she could see through him to the truth. That image, silent and unspectacular, was what people remembered. Not the lawyer's words. Not the police statement. A mother trying to recognize the shape of loss. Chapter 5. Fallout and discovery. After the detention, after the leak, after the city had poured itself into the shape of a single suspect, the release created a strange new kind of silence. People didn't relax. They recalibrated. Some turned their anger toward the police, accusing them of hesitation, of incompetence, of protecting the wrong people. Others turned their anger inward, embarrassed by how quickly they had embraced a story built from screenshots and dread. And families learned that public attention is not the same thing as progress. The searches continued, but they changed. The early days had been loud, volunteers in bright vests, photographers, helicopters, lines of people combing parks and ravines with the stubborn optimism of community. Now it was smaller groups, targeted grids, evidence technicians walking slowly, heads down, as if the ground itself might speak. Investigators focused on what the bag had given them, a starting point that was also a warning. Because whoever left those items behind had either made a mistake or wanted them found. Lab work began. Fibers, soil, trace particles caught in seams and zippers. A single hair can be nothing, or it can be a map. A smear can be accident, or it can be intention. Every sample was treated as if it mattered, because there was too little else. Detectives returned to phones, not just the missing women's devices, but the devices of people around them. They looked for a common thread that didn't rely on memory. They built timelines that measured minutes like currency. Maya's last day was reconstructed through receipts and camera angles. A coffee shop. A street corner. A streetcar where her face appeared briefly in the reflective window, looking down at her screen. A timestamp that said she was still herself, still moving through the world without knowing it was about to close. Olivia's night was pieced together through her friend's texts. The boutique closing. A quick meal. A mirror selfie sent with a laughing caption. The last message. Home soon. Sophia's Tuesday was the hardest because her routine was still forming. Fewer anchors. Fewer people who could say, this is normal for her, this is not. In the middle of all that work, a detective received a call from a woman who didn't want her name used. She said she had been on a date recently with a man from Tinder. Not the suspected man whose face had already been dragged across the city. A different one. She described a conversation that felt too smooth. A line that seemed rehearsed. The way he insisted on choosing the place, but framed it as caring. The way he suggested casually that she could come to his car to warm up between spots. She hadn't gone. She said, I got this feeling like he was trying to move me. Like he needed me not to be where people could see. That detail hit the investigation like a nail catching on fabric. Move them! Not harm them in public. Not risk noise. Not risk witnesses. Just move them. Detectives asked for the profile. She had screenshots. She had done what people now did automatically. Captured the image, the name, the bio, the photos. But when they tried to pull the profile up, it was gone. Deleted, or hidden, or replaced by a new one that used a different name and the same face. This wasn't proof, but it was the first sign that the threat might still be active. Police issued new guidance without admitting why. More patrols around nightlife corridors. More plainclothes officers near transit hubs. Quiet requests to universities and bars for cooperation. It was the kind of soft escalation the public only notices when it's already too late. Then came the second discovery. Not found by a trained team. Found by accident. A municipal worker trimming brush along a ravine edge noticed something that didn't belong. A strip of fabric snagged on branches, weathered and dull. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Just wrong in a place where the colors were supposed to be leaves and dirt. He called it in. The fabric matched an item from Olivia's missing person report. A scarf she'd worn often, photographed in more than one family picture. The kind of object you don't think about until it becomes evidence. The ravine area was searched again. Deeper. Slower. Dogs. Metal detectors. Ropes. The air was cold enough to sting throats, and every person there understood, without speaking it, that they were no longer searching for someone to wave from the trees. They were searching for what was left. Nothing else was recovered that day. But the location did something important. It narrowed the city. It suggested a corridor, a radius, a habit. And once you have a radius, you can compare it against other radii. You can lay maps over maps. You can ask whether the bag location and the ravine location share a route, a highway exit, a turn a person makes without thinking. That kind of analysis doesn't feel emotional in an office. But it becomes emotional when you realize it's describing someone's choices, someone's routine. The suspected man, now publicly marked but privately uncharged, became both a distraction and a warning. Tips about him kept coming even after his release. People wanted the story to stay simple. They wanted one villain with one address. Investigators, meanwhile, had to reopen their minds to the harder truth. If there was a single offender, he was careful. If there were multiple offenders, the city was facing something worse, the possibility that the disappearances were connected only by vulnerability. And that meant anyone could be next. Maya's mother began attending search briefings with a small notebook. She wrote down every term she didn't understand. Grid. Perimeter. Chain of custody. She learned the language because she couldn't bear to be spoken to like an outsider in her own daughter's absence. Sophia's family stopped giving interviews. They said nothing publicly for weeks. Some people interpreted it as giving up. It wasn't giving up. It was survival. Olivia's roommates moved out of their house. They couldn't stay. Every hallway felt like a throat closing. They left behind a bedroom that still held her scent in sweaters, a silent museum of a life paused. When the police finally held a briefing, they did not name a suspect. They did not promise an arrest. They asked for anyone who had met a man on Tinder and felt pressured to change locations, to get into a car, to go somewhere quieter, to come forward. It was a careful request, but it was also unmistakably fear in official form. And for the first time, the city understood that the investigation wasn't only about what had already happened. It was about stopping what might happen next. The ravine search after the scarf fragment turned up was the closest thing to a funeral the families had been given. It had the same careful movements, the same lowered voices, the same ritual of people gathering around something they did not want to touch. Investigators took soil samples from multiple depths. They checked drainage routes. They asked a geomatic specialist to model how objects might drift after heavy rain. The work was technical, but the motive was simple. Find her. Find any of them. When nothing else surfaced, the families were left with a cruel paradox. They had proof that something had happened, but not enough proof to say what. That kind of proof is a trap. It keeps you searching forever. Bennett began to re-interview people not because she expected new memories, but because time loosens tongues. People who held back out of fear sometimes speak months later when the adrenaline fades and guilt takes its place. One man admitted he had seen Sophia arguing with someone near a street corner the night she vanished. He hadn't reported it because he assumed it was a couple's fight. He assumed, like most people do, that other people's problems are private. He described the other person only vaguely. Average height, dark jacket, hands in pockets, a face he couldn't recall because he hadn't looked closely. That's the truth of city life. We train ourselves not to look too closely. Clark chased vehicle data next. Parking lots, toll routes, traffic cameras that caught license plates at intersections. It was expensive, time-consuming work, the kind that drains budgets and patience. It returned one notable overlap. A license plate that appeared near two relevant locations on two different nights, weeks apart. Not proof, but a thread. They traced it to a rental company. The renter's identity was not the name the public knew, not the man who had been detained and released. A different man entirely. A man with a common name, a clean record. A job that placed him in different parts of the city without raising questions. The police did not announce this. They moved quietly, because quiet is how you catch someone who is watching. When they finally approached him, they did not accuse. They asked for cooperation. He cooperated. He smiled at the right moments. He offered coffee. And then he contradicted himself on a small detail that he didn't realize mattered. He said he had never used Tinder, but his phone, when examined under warrant, showed the app's data remnants. A login token, a cached image, a string of notifications that had been cleared but not fully erased. For the first time in the case, something concrete surfaced. Not guilt, but connection. That was enough for the investigation to tilt, not toward certainty, toward pursuit. And it was in that tilt, subtle, procedural, almost invisible to the outside world, that the fallout deepened. Because now there was a new suspect, and the public didn't know his face. Which meant the city was still looking at strangers and wondering who they really were. Chapter 6. The ending. There is a particular kind of quiet that follows a case like this. Not the quiet of resolution. The quiet of exhaustion. Months passed. Seasons changed. Posters faded until they were peeled away or dissolved into pulp by rain and snow. New faces moved into old apartments. New headlines replaced the old ones. The city, as cities do, learned how to keep living around the wound without touching it directly. The investigation never closed. It narrowed, stalled, shifted direction, and narrowed again. Files grew thicker. Timelines were revised. Leads were followed to their ends and marked gently as dead. No single suspect was ever charged in connection with all 3 disappearances. The man who had once carried the weight of the city's fear moved away. Not dramatically. Quietly. He found work elsewhere. He tried unsuccessfully to rebuild a life that had been dismantled by suspicion. Some people continued to believe he was responsible. Others decided the truth was more complicated. He would never be fully free of the question. Neither would anyone else. What remained were fragments. A bracelet without a wrist. A scarf without a neck. Phones that never lit up again. Police would later say, in private conversations, that the case taught them something uncomfortable. That technology had outpaced trust. That people could vanish without crossing borders, without dramatic acts, without witnesses willing to be certain of what they saw. That modern disappearances don't always leave violence behind. Sometimes they leave ambiguity. Maya Chen's parents kept her room as it was. They stopped expecting answers, but they never stopped waiting. Waiting is not hope. It is something heavier. Something you carry because setting it down feels like betrayal. Olivia Hart's friends still toasted her on her birthday. They spoke about her in the present tense sometimes, catching themselves and continuing anyway. Memory does not obey grammar. Sofia Alvarez's family eventually returned to the city once a year, walking the streets she had loved and feared at the same time. They said it helped them remember that she had chosen this place for a reason. The dating app changed its safety features. New warnings, new prompts, new reminders to meet publicly, to share locations, to trust instincts. None of those changes could reach backward. And then, years later, a detective would say something during a training seminar that never made the news. He said, "The hardest cases aren't the ones where you don't know what happened. They're the ones where you know enough to be afraid, but not enough to be certain." 3 girls disappeared. 1 man was suspected. But suspicion, like fear, is not proof. And certainty never came. What remained was a lesson written quietly into the city's habits. Into the way people checked in. Into the way they hesitated before getting into a stranger's car. Into the way they understood that danger does not always announce itself with violence. Sometimes it arrives politely. Sometimes it smiles. And sometimes it leaves nothing behind but questions that never stop echoing. The new suspect was never named publicly in a way that satisfied everyone. Legal constraints, investigative strategy, and the fragility of evidence kept his identity mostly contained within court filings and private briefings. There were hearings. There were motions. There were delays that felt obscene to anyone who had been waiting for years. Some charges, in the end, were pursued. not always for the disappearances themselves, but for what could be proven. Identity fraud tied to app accounts, unlawful possession of someone else's property, interference with an investigation. Crimes that sounded small next to the scale of what the families lived with. The disappearances remained, in the strictest sense, unsolved. Not because nothing happened. Because the most important pieces never surfaced. No full timeline that could be sworn to. No final location that could be confirmed. No moment that could be named and held still. What the families received instead were probabilities. Investigators speaking softly about likely outcomes. Prosecutors explaining standards of proof. Counselors reminding them that closure is not a promise the world can make. People outside the case sometimes asked the wrong question. They asked, why did they use Tinder? As if the app was the crime. As if the missing had invited danger by wanting what everyone wants at some point. Connection, attention, a chance at being understood. The better question was the one nobody could answer cleanly. How did a person learn to move through a city without being seen, without leaving a trace, without triggering the alarms we assume exist? That question did not belong only to this case. It belonged to the era. In the end, the case left Toronto with habits rather than answers. More check-ins, more screenshots, more insistence on meeting in public, more people choosing caution over spontaneity, even when it made life smaller. And for the families, the ending was not a line. It was a condition. Maya's mother kept a copy of her daughter's last voice note on her phone and listened to it on nights when the apartment felt too quiet. Olivia's roommates years later still paused outside certain bars as if expecting to see her through the window. Sophia's brother kept driving sometimes, without a destination, because motion was the only way he knew to hold grief without collapsing. 3 girls disappeared. 1 man was suspected, then another. And the city learned, slowly and painfully, that danger does not always arrive with force. Sometimes it arrives as an invitation. Sometimes it arrives as patience. Sometimes it arrives smiling, and you don't realize you're being moved until the street behind you is already too far away. On one winter evening, long after the headlines had thinned, Detective Bennett walked past a lamppost where the posters had once been. The tape marks were still there, faint rectangles of cleaner paint where paper had shielded the metal from grime. She stopped anyway. Not because she expected a miracle, because stopping was the only honest response left. A couple passed behind her, laughing, their hands linked. A streetcar bell rang in the distance. Life continuing, indifferent and unstoppable. Bennett thought about the first phone call in the first file. The roommate's trembling voice. The way she had said, she wouldn't do this, as if willpower alone could prevent disappearance. The city had built whole systems on that same assumption, and this case had cracked it. If there was a lesson, it wasn't a moral. It wasn't a warning carved neatly into a slogan. It was a quieter truth. That safety is not a guarantee. It is a practice. It is a set of choices made in the dark, when you would rather believe the world is kind. And when you cannot believe it, you learn to keep your eyes open anyway. For some people, the app was deleted. For others, it stayed, only now every swipe carried weight.